Ladies and gentlemen, if you are enjoying my videos, please click the like button. It is the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. In the Walls, Gateway to the Otherworld. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1, A New Beginning. The moving truck rumbled to a stop, its hydraulic whine a jarring counterpoint to the tranquil chirping of crickets. David Walker hopped out, stretched his stiff back, and surveyed their new home. The Victorian house, painted a faded shade of lavender, stood nestled amongst towering oaks, their branches clawing at the twilight sky. A shiver danced down Sarah's spine, a reaction she couldn't quite explain. It was a beautiful house, everything they'd ever dreamed of: spacious rooms, a sprawling backyard, a fireplace that promised cozy winter evenings. But beneath the charm, there lurked a subtle unease, a hidden note of discord in the symphony of crickets. Ethan, their 8-year-old son, was already bounding towards the house, his face alight with excitement. "This is gonna be the best house ever," he declared, throwing open the creaking front door. A wave of musty air rushed out, carrying the scent of dust and forgotten memories. David followed, the floorboards groaning under his weight, as if protesting his intrusion. Inside, shadows stretched from ornate picture frames, and dust motes danced in a sunbeam slanting through a stained glass window. The house was undeniably old, with intricate crown molding and faded floral wallpaper that whispered of a bygone era. Ethan skipped ahead, his eyes wide as he took in everything: the grand staircase with its worn banister, the tall windows that offered glimpses of the looming trees, and most captivatingly, the numerous mirrors adorning the walls. Ethan stopped abruptly before a large oval mirror, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Hi," he whispered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. David caught Sarah's eye, a flicker of concern flitting across her face. He squeezed her hand reassuringly. Maybe it was just the strangeness of a new place, the echo bouncing off the walls. As they explored further, the subtle unease deepened. Drafts snaked through the house, seemingly emanating from nowhere, sending shivers down Sarah's arms. A floorboard creaked ominously, although Ethan had just walked past it. And then there were the lights. Despite all the windows, the house seemed perpetually shrouded in a gloom that flickered with unsettling regularity. Each flicker cast grotesque shadows that danced across the walls, morphing and twisting with an unsettling life of their own. Ethan, oblivious to the unsettling atmosphere, continued his exploration, his fascination with the mirrors growing stronger. He pressed his hand against a cool surface, tracing the ornate frame. "Can we keep all the mirrors, Mommy?" he asked, his voice bouncing off the glass. Sarah hesitated, a strange reluctance blooming in her chest. The mirrors seemed to magnify the unsettling feeling, reflecting the shadows in distorted forms. It was as if the house itself was watching them, observing their every move with 1,000 cold eyes. "We'll see, sweetie," she managed, forcing a smile. David, preoccupied with unpacking boxes, didn't seem to notice the unsettling undercurrent. But as Sarah looked at their faces reflected in the glass, distorted and pale, a shiver ran down her spine. The new house, once a symbol of hope and a fresh start, now felt like a watchful entity, shrouded in secrets it didn't want to reveal. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Reflection. The first few days in the old house were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling in. Despite the initial unease, a sense of normalcy settled in. Or so Sarah thought. The strange flickers in the lights became more frequent, causing momentary disruptions in their conversations. Objects, particularly small toys of Ethan's, had a tendency to disappear only to reappear in the most unexpected places: on top of bookshelves, nestled amongst dishes in the drying rack. One evening, as Sarah was tucking Ethan into bed, a faint whisper seemed to slither through the room. It was a sound like dry leaves rustling in a forgotten corner, barely audible, yet distinctly unsettling. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Did you hear that, Mommy?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah forced a smile. "It's just the old house settling, honey. Nothing to worry about." But the feeling of unease wouldn't dissipate. It clung to her like a spider web, its silken threads tickling at the edges of her consciousness. The next morning, David announced over breakfast, "Ethan, where on earth did you find your dinosaur under the kitchen sink?" Ethan, munching on cereal, looked up with a shrug. He was lonely, I guess. He wanted to see the pipes. David chuckled, but Sarah noticed a flicker of concern in his eyes. The misplaced dinosaur wasn't the first instance of these strange occurrences. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Later that day, Sarah was dusting a bookshelf in the living room when she noticed a slight discrepancy in the reflection of a nearby mirror. An unsettling chill crawled down her spine as she saw a fleeting glimpse of movement, a shadow darting behind a bookshelf in the mirror's image. In the real world, the room was empty. Shaking herself off, Sarah attributed it to overactive imagination. Still, the whispers continued, more frequent now, emanating from seemingly random corners of the house. They sounded like fragments of a forgotten language, chilling and incomprehensible. Ethan, however, seemed completely unfazed. He developed a disturbing habit of staring intently into the mirrors, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Mirror friend says hi, Mommy," he announced one day, looking up from his contemplation. Sarah knelt beside him, her stomach churning. "Mirror friend?" "Yep," Ethan chirped, a wide grin plastered on his face. "He lives in the mirror and plays hide and seek with me sometimes." A cold dread washed over Sarah. The playful innocence in Ethan's voice made the situation even more terrifying. David, on the other hand, remained skeptical. When Sarah confided her worries about the whispers and the mirror friend, he dismissed it as childish imagination and Sarah's overactive nerves. That night, as Sarah lay in bed, unable to sleep, the whispers reached a crescendo. They seemed to swarm around her, swirling into a nightmarish symphony of unintelligible sound. It was then, as sleep finally claimed her, that she had the dream. She was standing in the hallway, the air thick with a suffocating darkness. A figure, shrouded in shadow, lurked at the far end of the corridor. It moved with a chilling, jerky rhythm, its form shifting and warping with every step. As it drew closer, Sarah felt a scream rise in her throat, a scream that died before it could escape. The figure reached out, a skeletal hand brushing against the edge of her vision, and then she woke with a gasp. Sitting upright in bed, heart pounding, Sarah looked around the darkened room. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic creaking of the floorboards. Was it just a dream? Or something more? In the dim light, filtering through the window, the shape of the furniture seemed to morph and twist, mimicking the distorted shadows of her nightmare. A shiver ran down her spine. This charming old house, once a symbol of new beginnings, now felt increasingly like a tomb, its secrets slowly clawing their way to the surface. And Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Chapter 3. The Spiritualist. The chilling experience lingered with Sarah like a shroud. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of a malevolent presence lurking in the shadows. The whispers seemed to follow her everywhere, a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong. David, on the other hand, remained unfazed. He chalked up Sarah's fear to the stress of moving and her vivid imagination. But Sarah couldn't ignore the growing unease, the prickling sensation at the back of her her neck that wouldn't subside. Finally, desperation gnawed at her. She had to do something. "David," she started hesitantly that night. David glanced up from his newspaper, a frown creasing his brow. "Someone? Who?" Medium," Sarah stammered. "Someone who can help us understand what's happening in this house." David scoffed. "Sarah, come on. It's just an old house settling. There are no ghosts or spirits." But Sarah's voice, usually gentle and hesitant, held an edge of steel. "David, I'm serious. The whispers, the moving objects, Ethan talking to his mirror friend. It's not normal." David studied her face for a long moment, the skepticism softening in his eyes. He saw the raw fear etched there, and a pang of guilt stabbed at him. Perhaps he hadn't been listening closely enough. The next morning, Sarah found a listing for a local spiritualist named Ems. Helena, hesitantly, she explained their situation over the phone. Miss Helena's response was calm but grave. She agreed to come over that very evening. The air crackled with nervous energy as Miss Helena entered the house, her eyes scanning the rooms with an unnerving intensity. She moved through the house like a pendulum, stopping at certain points, her brow furrowed in concentration. The whispers, usually faint, seemed to crescendo in her presence, whirling around her like a dark fog. Finally, she stopped in front of the large oval mirror in the living room, the same one Ethan had befriended. A low moan escaped her lips, a sound so foreign and unsettling it sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Mrs. Helena traced the ornate frame with a trembling hand, her eyes closed. Suddenly, a loud crack shattered the tense silence. The mirror, once reflecting their anxious faces, now sported a jagged spiderweb of cracks emanating from a single point where Miss Helena had touched. A gasp escaped Sarah's lips. Miss Helena opened her eyes, their depths filled with a dark certainty. "There is a malevolent entity trapped within these walls," she declared, her voice raspy. "A powerful negative energy focused on a gateway." David, who had been watching skeptically, now had a flicker of fear in his eyes. "A gateway? To what?" Miss Helena shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know, but it's strong. It feeds on fear. You need to get out of this house, now." She began a cleansing ritual, smudging the rooms with burning sage and chanting an ancient incantation in a language Sarah couldn't understand. As she performed the ritual, the whispers intensified, morphing into guttural growls that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Ethan, who had been playing in another room, burst in, tears streaming down his face. "Mommy, it's getting angry," he cried, pointing at the mirror. Panic clawed at Sarah's throat. Ignoring Mrs. Helena's continued chanting, she scooped Ethan into her arms and turned to David. "Get the car ready. We're leaving." David hesitated, torn between belief and disbelief. He glanced at the frightened faces of his wife and son, then back at Miss Helena, her brow furrowed in concentration as she finished the ritual. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. They left the house in a hurry, the unsettling echoes of the whispers trailing behind them like a chilling melody. Miss Helena's warning echoed in Sarah's mind, a gateway. It was a terrifying concept, and as they drove away from the old house, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving more than a house behind. They were leaving a darkness, a lurking entity, and perhaps a gateway to an unimaginable horror. Chapter 4: Fractured Reality. The drive away from the old house felt like an escape from a nightmare. Sarah clutched Ethan close, his trembling form mirroring her own inner turmoil. The unsettling echoes of Miss Helena's warning, a gateway, and the chilling image of the cracked mirror stayed etched in their minds. They found temporary refuge at a small motel on the outskirts of town. The sterile white walls and artificial lighting offered a stark contrast to the looming shadows and unsettling whispers of the old house. Yet, despite the change in scenery, a sense of unease clung to them like a shroud. Days turned into weeks, and despite the initial relief, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Every flicker in the motel lights, every creak of the floorboards, sent shivers down her spine. Sleep was a fragile thing, filled with fragmented dreams and the lingering echoes of whispers. One evening, Sarah caught a glimpse of something unsettling in the bathroom mirror. It was just a fleeting image, a reflection of a man standing at the doorway, but a man she didn't recognize. He was tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. The reflection vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Sarah staring at her own reflection, pale and shaken. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of her overactive imagination? She couldn't be sure, but the encounter left a cold dread in its wake. Ethan, too, seemed to be affected by their experience at the old house. He became withdrawn, spending long periods staring into mirrors, mumbling to himself in hushed tones. When Sarah questioned him, he simply shrugged and mumbled about playing with Mirror Friend. One morning, while cleaning the room, Sarah noticed a frayed section of wallpaper in the corner of the bedroom, peeling back. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she gently pulled back the loose paper, revealing a dark stain on the wall beneath. A sense of dread washed over her. David, returning from work, found her kneeling by the wall, her face pale. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he saw the stain. "I don't know," Sarah mumbled, her voice trembling. Together, they carefully removed the rest of the wallpaper. Beneath the stain, tucked into a shallow cavity in the wall, was a small, weathered object. David picked it up, his face grim. It was a single bone, smooth and white with age. The discovery sent a jolt of fear through them. This wasn't just an old house with strange noises. This was something more, something sinister. The bone, like the whispers and the unsettling reflection, was a chilling testament to a dark secret buried within the walls. A knot of fear tightened in Sarah's stomach. Leaving the motel room felt like a band-aid ripped from a festering wound. They had escaped the house, but it seemed the house hadn't quite let go of them. And the discovery of the bone only served as a grim reminder of the horrors that might lie hidden within the walls and the possibility that the gateway mess Helena spoke of was more real than they dared to imagine. Chapter 5: Secrets in the Walls. Driven by a morbid curiosity mixed with a growing fear, Sarah and David returned to the old house. The air hung heavy with silence, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the floorboards under their hesitant steps. Ethan, sensing their anxiety, clung tightly to Sarah's hand, his eyes wide and wary. Their first stop was the room where they discovered the bone. Sarah scanned the walls with a frantic intensity, searching for any other telltale signs. David ran his hand along the baseboards, his fingers brushing against a loose floorboard. With a grunt, he pried it open, revealing a dark cavity. Inside, nestled amongst dust and cobwebs, lay another bone. Panic clawed at Sarah's throat. 2 bones. How many more were hidden within these walls? The weight of a horrifying possibility settled upon them. Their unsettling experiences weren't just a random occurrence. The house, with its whispers and chilling shadows, seemed to be harboring a dark secret. Their frantic search continued. They discovered more hidden bones behind crumbling plaster, tucked into forgotten corners of the attic, and buried deep within the crawl space beneath the house. Each discovery was a chilling confirmation of their growing suspicion. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a tomb. David, fueled by a mixture of anger and fear, began digging into the history of the house. Days were spent, hunched over dusty tomes in the local library, piecing together a fragmented narrative. He unearthed whispers of disappearances, families who vanished without a trace, children who simply never came home. The dates of these disappearances coincided with the construction of the house. The reality settled like a lead weight in Sarah's gut. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a gateway to something more sinister. A gateway that may have claimed the lives of those who came before them. Desperate for answers, David called in a specialist, a man named Professor Miller, an expert in archaeology and the paranormal. Professor Miller arrived at the house, his gaze sharp and assessing. He examined the bones, the stain on the wall, and listened intently to their account of the whispers and Miss Helena's warnings. As the professor meticulously analyzed his findings, Sarah began to experience disturbing hallucinations. Out of the corner of her eye, she glimpsed distorted figures flitting through the shadows, their faces obscured by a chilling darkness. The whispers seemed to intensify, slithering around her like venomous serpents. David, oblivious to his wife's deteriorating mental state, watched as Professor Miller pointed at a map of the town spread on the table. The location of the house coincides with an ancient burial ground, he explained, his voice grave. Legends speak of a gateway, a portal to another realm, built upon the bones of the sacrificed. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The gateway Miss Helena spoke of was real. It was within their house, fueled by the hidden bones and fueled by their fear. Professor Miller's words sent a shiver down her spine, confirming their worst fears and propelling them towards a terrifying truth. The house they once dreamt of, their supposed haven, was now a prison, trapping them within the clutches of a malevolent entity. Chapter 6. The Gateway Revealed. The weight of Professor Miller's words hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken dread. Sarah, pale and trembling, watched as the professor meticulously examined the bones under a powerful lamp. Human, he finally announced, his voice grim, and likely very young. David ran a hand through his hair, his face etched with disbelief. Children, he choked out. Professor Miller nodded solemnly. The analysis confirms it. These bones belong to children, most likely from decades ago. He gestured towards a table where his equipment lay. Amongst it, a single photograph stood out. It was a picture of the living room, a seemingly ordinary snapshot, except for one detail. A distorted, grotesque face stared back from the reflection in the mirror. Sarah gasped, a cold dread slithering down her spine. The image confirmed Miss Helena's haunting words and the chilling reflection Sarah herself had witnessed. The house wasn't simply haunted. It was a conduit, a gateway to something horrifying. David stared at the photo, his initial skepticism crumbling. In the face of such concrete evidence, denial became impossible. He finally understood the unease that had plagued Sarah, the whispers and shadows she kept describing. So, it's true? He whispered, his voice hoarse. Professor Miller nodded. There is a gateway within these walls, fueled by negative energy and the remains of the sacrificed. Ethan, who had been unusually quiet throughout the professor's visit, piped up from his corner. "Mirror friend told me about the door," he said, his voice tinged with a strange excitement. Sarah and David exchanged a worried glance. Since their return to the house, Ethan's fascination with the mirrors had intensified. He spent hours talking to his reflection friend, muttering secrets they couldn't decipher. His innocent words now sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "Door?" Professor Miller asked, his curiosity piqued. Ethan nodded eagerly. "Mirror friend said it's behind the big painting in the hallway." It leads to where the shadows come from. Professor Miller's eyes narrowed as he considered Ethan's words. Could the child, with his strange connection to the mirrors, be unknowingly revealing the location of the gateway? David knelt beside Ethan, trying to reason with him. "Honey, there's no door behind the painting. It's just your imagination." But Ethan shook his head stubbornly. "Mirror friend wouldn't lie. He wants to show me what's behind the door." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The gateway, Professor Miller had explained, thrived on fear. Ethan's innocent fascination could be his undoing. They couldn't risk letting him anywhere near a potential doorway to another dimension. A fierce protectiveness surged within Sarah. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about saving their son from an unseen entity lurking within the walls. Professor Miller, sensing their urgency, began outlining a plan. Defusing the gateway wouldn't be easy, but with the bones removed and a potent cleansing ritual, they might be able to sever its connection to the other realm. But first, they had to find the gateway. And with Ethan's disturbing information, the large painting in the hallway now held a terrifying significance. Chapter 7: Desperate Measures. With Professor Miller's solemn assessment hanging heavy in the air, a frantic search for answers consumed Sarah and David. They spent the next few days scouring libraries and dusty antique shops, desperate for any information that might help them seal the gateway and escape the clutches of the house. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by gnawing anxiety that twisted in their guts. Ethan, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the full extent of their terror. His fascination with his mirror friend intensified, his conversations laced with cryptic references to the door and a shadowy world beyond. One evening, amidst a mountain of dusty books, Sarah stumbled upon an ancient, leather-bound text tucked away in a forgotten corner of the library. Its pages, yellowed with age, were filled with arcane symbols and cryptic script. With Professor Miller's help, they deciphered enough to understand it was a grimoire, a book of rituals. One specific ritual, in particular, caught their attention, banishing a spirit through a mirror gateway. Hope, a fragile flame, flickered within them. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the solution they desperately craved. But the ritual itself was chilling. It required them to stand before a mirror, confronting their deepest fears reflected back at them. The entity, according to the text, would feed on their terror, making the ritual incredibly dangerous. David wrestled with the idea. The danger to themselves was immense, but the alternative, leaving Ethan at the mercy of the entity, was unthinkable. Sarah, fueled by a fierce maternal instinct, was ready to face anything to keep her son safe. Meanwhile, Ethan's behavior took a disturbing turn. He became withdrawn, his eyes vacant and filled with a strange intensity. He would spend hours staring into mirrors, his whispers becoming more frantic, less playful. One night, Sarah awoke to a bone-chilling sound, Ethan's laughter echoing through the hallway. Rushing to his room, she found him standing before the mirror, his face contorted in a chilling smile. "Mirror friend is happy," he shrieked, his voice laced with a darkness that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "He says we'll all go see the shadows soon." Fear gripped Sarah's heart like a vice. Was Ethan possessed? Had the entity already taken hold of him? Professor Miller, upon hearing their concerns, offered a grim explanation. Fear, particularly a child's innocent fear, was the gateway's fuel. Ethan's connection to the mirrors made him particularly vulnerable, potentially a bridge for the entity to enter their world. Time was running out. They had to perform the ritual before the entity fully took hold of Ethan. Professor Miller spent the next day gathering the necessary ingredients: herbs, sigils, and a vial of a shimmering liquid they couldn't decipher. Tension crackled in the air as they set up the ritual space, a single mirror standing at its center, reflecting their worried faces and the gathering darkness that threatened to consume them. As they stood before the mirror, its surface now shimmering with an otherworldly light, Sarah squeezed David's hand, a silent promise to face their fears together. They had to be strong, not just for themselves, but for Ethan, their innocent son caught in the crossfire between worlds. With trembling hands and hearts pounding like drums, they began the ritual, their voices a whisper, barely audible over the rising whispers emanating from the mirror's depths. The battle for their sanity, for their son, and for their lives was about to begin. Chapter 8: Confrontation and Choice. The air crackled with an unseen energy as Sarah and David stood before the mirror, the heart of the ritual. Professor Miller's voice, a low chant punctuated by the clinking of ritual tools, echoed through the room. Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze meeting her reflection in the glass. It was a distorted image, her eyes filled with fear, lines etched deeper around her face with worry. The chant shifted, focusing on David. His reflection contorted a reflection of his darkest insecurities, the fear of failure, of being a bad father. Sarah saw him flinch, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Yet, he held strong, his voice joining the chant, unwavering. The whispers from the mirror intensified, morphing into guttural growls and chilling laughter. The air grew heavy, thick with the entity's malevolent presence. A sense of dread, cold and suffocating, threatened to consume them. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house. It came from upstairs, from Ethan's room. Fear cut through Sarah like a blade. Rushing out of the ritual space, she found Ethan standing in front of the large painting in the hallway, his eyes glazed over, a chilling smile playing on his lips. "Mirror friend says goodbye," he shrieked in a distorted voice, his hand reaching out towards the wall. Sarah gasped. With a sickening crack, the painting ripped away, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness, the gateway. The entity, using Ethan as a conduit, was attempting to break free. A horrifying realization slammed into Sarah. The ritual wouldn't be enough. Sealing the gateway meant severing the connection to the entity, severing the connection to Ethan as well. He was the bridge, the key. She stumbled back, tears stinging her eyes. The choice was impossible. Sacrifice their son, the innocent victim trapped in this nightmare, or let the entity loose, potentially unleashing a terror they couldn't comprehend. David appeared beside her, his face etched with agony. He understood the weight of the decision, the impossible choice thrust upon them. He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with a question, a plea: could they live with themselves if they condemned their son? Sarah locked eyes with her reflection, a desperate plea mirrored back at her. Could she condemn the world, countless others, to protect her own child? The vortex pulsed, the darkness tendrils reaching out, beckoning Ethan forward. Professor Miller's voice rose above the chaos, a desperate plea to finish the ritual before it was too late. Time seemed to stretch, seconds morphing into an eternity. In that agonizing moment, Sarah made a choice that would forever scar her soul. With a choked sob, she grabbed David's hand, their eyes locked in a silent understanding. They turned back to the mirror, a newfound resolve hardening their features. They finished the ritual, the room erupting in a blinding flash of light. The vortex shrieked, a sound of pure rage and frustration, before collapsing in on itself, sealing the gateway with a sickening thud. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Ethan crumpled to the floor, his face pale and vacant. The entity was gone, its hold severed. But as Sarah rushed to her son's side, a chilling realization settled upon her. The fight might be over, but the house, its walls now silent, felt strangely empty. A part of Ethan, the innocent spark that connected him to the mirrors, was also gone. He opened his eyes, a vacant stare replacing the chilling possession. He looked up at Sarah, his voice devoid of the usual warmth. "Who are you?" The question hung in the air, a stark reminder of the consequences of their choice. They had saved themselves, saved the world, perhaps, but at the cost of a piece of their son, a piece that might never return. But weeks bled into months. Ethan's vacant stare softened, replaced by a cautious flicker of recognition. Mirrors still held a faint echo of fear, but he was getting better. Sarah and David, though forever marked, found solace in his recovery. They sold the house, a constant reminder of darkness, and started anew. One day, packing, Sarah found a small mirror. Hesitantly, she offered it to Ethan. Fear flickered, then curiosity. He held it up, catching his reflection. "Mommy," he whispered. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "Yes, honey," she replied. "That's you." Ethan stared, fear melting away. In the reflection, Sarah saw not just her son, but a glimpse of the innocent boy he once was, and the brave young man he was becoming. They would carry scars, but their bond, stronger than ever, would see them through.